win the trophy. So, all right. Well, again, folks, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to be presenting on finding identity as a new counselor in the midst of COVID-19. And again, thank you so much for spending your time with us. We wanted to start off simply by welcoming you, and we're going to tell you a little bit about each of us right now. And then we'll go into the learning objectives, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah, so good morning. Thanks everyone for joining in. I am Bethany, and so I'll be co-presenting with Dr. Shupp here, and I am a graduate from Shippensburg University. I graduated last May in the midst of all of the fun with COVID. And in that time, in the last year, I actually have been working as a counselor on the campus that I graduated from, doing mental health counseling there. And then I'm also working in the community as a counselor. So I'm balancing both of those, kind of doing two part-time counseling positions. And I'm loving it. I've been enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to presenting today in some of the different things that I've been learning in this last year, and have the privilege of being supervised by Dr. Shupp, who used to be one of my professors and is now my clinical supervisor for licensure here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. And folks, again, my name is Matthew Shupp. I am an associate professor in the Department of Counseling and College Student Personnel at Shippensburg University, but I'm also part of a small private practice where I see, I don't know, about 8 or 10 clients a week. And yes, absolutely. I think you'll learn a little bit more about our lived experience as we go through the presentation. And let's see, Ebony, are you able yet to share any of the poll questions?
So I am actually, I was just made the host, which is great, except I still do not see the option to launch polls yet.
All right.
So we're still working on it. I apologize.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We will certainly roll with it. We'll go ahead and just jump into the learning objectives to know exactly where, hopefully, where we get to in the next 45 minutes or so. But Bethany is going to start us off by really talking about some specific challenges of beginning clinical work during a global pandemic. And from the chat box, what I saw is that there is a range of experiences and years in the field. So I think this will certainly lead to a very robust, hopefully, dialogue. Again, as we are talking, if something speaks to you, or you're moved by something, or you wanted to clarify something, please feel free to add it into the chat box at any time. Next, hopefully we'll be able to analyze and evaluate your own method of practice and self-care. Hopefully you'll learn specific ways of protecting against burnout and compassion fatigue. And then lastly, examine innovative and effective supervision strategies and how supervision at all levels, regardless of where we are in the field, can help with some of the first 3 objectives that we had just mentioned. So with that, we were going to do a polling question. So Bethany, can you go to the next slide for me? But I think what might be easiest is if you could just put in the chat box for now. How about this question? How prepared did you feel to transition to a virtual clinical environment? How prepared did you feel? So did you feel very prepared? And that could be to supervise, that could be to see clients. How prepared did you feel to transition to a virtual clinical environment? I know some folks are working on their postdocs, so maybe that is from an academic perspective as well. So how prepared did you feel to transition to a virtual clinical environment? So I see that yeah, the Chicago School has a telebehavior class, transitioning quickly, standards of practice, good, slightly prepared, moderately prepared, somewhat prepared, about 50-50, not prepared at all. Amy and or Monica, before we get started, I was just wondering your thoughts. Not prepared at all or trained in 1 week. Can either of you or both of you just share those experiences?
We lived in rural and there's only 2 of us covering 4 counties, and we were just thrown into it and said, figure it out.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you for the work that you do. There's 2 of you covering 4 counties. I can't imagine your workload.
And I work, excuse me, and I work in the Bay Area in California, and our agency has over 70 therapists who are interns and licensed in a variety of capacity, and we support schools in our Bay Area. And I can't remember how many schools we're at, thousands of students. And we were physically down 1 week, transitioned to home offices, and trained and effectively working telehealth with our students the following week. It was pretty amazing and impactful. And so we've been doing that since last March.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing. And I'm wondering, did you use the word trained in air quotes when you were saying that? We were down for a week and then trained?
Yeah, actually, we had a training course that they had us do online. And then our schools got us the materials that we needed, equipment that we needed at home if we didn't have it. We had to set up our home offices or private spaces that were confidential. And so we took an online training course that took approximately, 2-3 days for us to do. And then we started work. We were up and running in 1 week.
Well, again, thank you for the good work you do as well.
Yeah, when I say trained, I mean, we were given a laminated piece of paper, and we live in Iowa, and our hospitals weren't even up and running for telehealth. So our SANE nurses for sexual assault didn't even know how to work the iPad for telehealth. And so it was horrible. It was just horrible for the poor nurses.
Well, again, thank you both for your comments. And Bethany, I'm going to pass it over to you. I'm wondering, does this sound at all familiar to you in terms of what you've experienced with some of your new challenges as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we will I'm going to roll into what was specifically challenging, as a new clinician, and hopefully as we do that, you'll hear and maybe be challenged in some of the ways that you yourself were challenged in that moment. And maybe now, after a year of doing this work this way, as things maybe settle a bit, being able to then reestablish your ways of practice. So hopefully in this presentation, you'll be able to glean some from a new clinician and the things that I have found challenging in this last year, and also that will be helpful for those of you who have been at this for some time as well. So these are just some of the points that, again, as I took some time to reflect, like, what has this last year actually been as me as a clinician, and what are the ways that I have felt challenged. I think that some of these are not exclusive to being in a pandemic, but we're certainly heightened. Remember having conversations prior to graduating in May of last year, where I was really fearful of what some of this was going to look like, let alone like not knowing there would be even more of a need for these different areas to be pushed and worked on within myself. So we're going to get started into some of these specific areas. I'm going to spend, just because of time, I'm going to spend some more time on the areas that have been more important for me personally, but we do plan on sending out the PowerPoint to everyone after the presentation. So there's maybe some information in here that if we don't spend as much time doing a deep dive into, that you can spend that time reflecting after the presentation. So for me, and a lot of these, Dr. Shupp was there as the supervisor. So it'll be kind of a collaboration of me talking about my experience, but also I leaned heavily on him, and still do, for supervision in the state of Pennsylvania, needing to get postgraduate supervision hours. And so I'm very thankful for that. One of the things is imposter syndrome. So maybe as I'm chatting and going through some of this in the chat box, if you could say, those of you who have been at this, are more seasoned, can you just let us know in the chat box, do you still feel like an imposter? Or is that just like a new thing for those of us who are coming fresh out of the gates of grad school or our training program? So if you could answer that in the chat box. But imposter syndrome is this belief that you're not as competent as what people think you are, or as you're supposed to be. And so sitting with a client and having that moment where you're like, oh, I am actually your counselor. You're coming to me because you have a need in your life, or you're mandated to come, and you're expecting something of me. Can I actually provide that service to you? And one of the things that I was challenged with is coming back to the basics. I don't have extended training in trauma or in CBT or different methods of counseling, but the basics of the relationship are the things that is the strength that I can draw from. So with that came knowing my own limitations, and that not being a bad thing, a negative thing, but recognizing where I am limited, and accepting that. Also, the next ones we'll talk a bit more about in future slides, but managing my own expectations, and like I said, leaning on supervision. For me, managing my expectations was huge. And I think probably I can imagine for those of you who were veteran as well, having to shift into the pandemic and providing care in a way that maybe you haven't before, in an intensity that you haven't before. It's unrealistic to think that we have all the answers, right? Or that we'd be able to do it perfectly, especially given the landscape of this last year. And so being able to remain flexible in that, knowing and accepting again that there were areas that I knew I was not like thriving in, and being able to just be honest about that. But I think for me, a big part of it was learning to trust myself, learning to trust that what I have in me as a tool, as the counselor, was enough for me to rely on. That I've been given instruction, I have instinct, I have different areas of strength that I could really rely on, especially when things were off kilter. And again, supervision was very important to be able to come back and say, this session rocked me a little bit. This session was difficult for me. And so being able to talk through that and to be honest about how I was doing, handling all of that. The one that I probably have the most passion for is boundaries. And so this was something that I think in my grad school time started to really learn and understand for myself. And so you'll see a number of questions here, excuse me, you'll see a number of questions here that I had to ask myself. And as I was listening to some of the experiences that the two of you shared with us, maybe some of these aren't realistic for you because of the intensity of your environment. I recognize that in the way that my structure is in my employment, I'm able to have some flexibility. So I was able to kind of structure what is a healthy amount of clients for me to see each week. Because I remember having a conversation with a family member who was like, how many hours? Like, how many clients can you fit in? I was like, I think 8. And now I look at that, I'm like, I don't have the mental energy personally for 8 clients a day. So being able to make that decision of this is the healthy number mentally, emotionally, physically that I can handle. And obviously there's financial implications for that as well. And being able to really make decisions about, am I qualified to work with this specific population? What's the work and what's the limitations there? And how do I fit everything into this 40-hour work week, or whatever the work week looks like? you know, is there time for me to do professional development and progress notes? Because it feels sometimes like the momentum of seeing clients, the other stuff gets pushed aside, which can go on for a bit of time, but then being able to take a step back and say, I'm feeling flooded. I'm feeling like I'm not catching up in the way, especially with progress notes. You know, I remember in grad school, hearing people complain about the amount of time progress notes takes, and kind of like rolling my eyes like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And then now getting into it, I recognize there's a reason that those things are all said. And so for myself, having to ask questions around what are my professional boundaries and what does that look like in the midst of an agency or a counseling center? How can I structure my time in order to make sure that I am getting what I need out of the time, and my clients are getting what they need. And then you also see that I wrote on there personal boundaries. There was a week just recently where I had friends and family. There was one evening, I think I got like 4 text messages for people asking me for connections to counselors and advice and resources. And it was one of those things where I was like, whew, I need to evaluate how am I communicating to people in the way that I'm going to support them outside of counseling. Because once that stamp is on that we are counselors, there's this expectation that we will be able to support. So being able to communicate what your personal boundary is around how much you're able to help, who you're able to help. And also a big question for me was, what are the ways that I'm putting myself in groups, in relationships that I'm not always giving, that I'm able to receive or be Bethany as Bethany and not Bethany counselor. And that kind of rolls into, you know, if I'm feeling fatigued outside of counseling life, more than likely I'm going to feel fatigued in counseling life as well. So maybe the questions for you look different, but these were some of the ones that I really had to ask myself, especially in the landscape of COVID, when it's not, you know, for me, you know, we're spending all this time on the computer, and that was one of the ways that I connected with people. And so then I had to change it to like, well, I guess I'll go for walks, and having to think outside the box. I didn't think before graduating that those would be so crucial to me as a counselor, but they ended up being so. So I want to pause here and ask that we answer another poll question in the chat box. And this one is, so as a clinician, do you feel you're able to effectively set boundaries for work and self-care? You know, would you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with that? So if you could put your answer in the chat box. Again, the question is, I feel as a clinician that I'm able to effectively set boundaries for work and self-care. And I'll just wait. I don't know, Dr. Shupp, if you can give just some answers as they come in, because I can't.
Yeah, so far two have come in, a 3 agree. Agree.
Great.
Wow, a lot of folks are agreeing. In my current agency, strongly disagree. from Marie again. Agree. Well, I'm wondering for some folks that have neutral, working from home is difficult. I'm wondering from 1 or 2 folks that we haven't heard from that maybe say agree. What are you finding is important to you to be able to balance work and life boundaries? Anybody that maybe had said agree? I see Natasha, Monica, Miranda, Jen. Any thoughts?
For me, family time is important, especially with the kids not really having full days at school. So I don't want them to feel neglected while I'm having sessions all day. So just having that balance with work and family time is important for me.
Thanks, Natasha. And Nina put something, Bethany, in the chat box that said, I'm a full-time research coordinator and student. So disagree, but it's only a season, right? And I think I mean, context is really important, right? Where we've been maybe for the last year may be part of our normal, right? Where we've had a hard time balancing work and personal boundaries, but it may just be a season where might be seeing the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. Even though over the last year or last couple of months, maybe it's been challenging where those lines have been blurred.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that going along with that, I think that one of the things that, you know, asking myself in those seasons where it felt like there was no time or space to set a boundary, being able to say, and we'll get into this in the next slide, what is it that I actually need? You know, maybe I have 30 minutes, or maybe it's a before bedtime rhythm that I want to start setting. But what is it that I actually need right now? And is there a small way that I can work that in, right? So we're going to prioritize what's important to us. And that might feel like we don't have the time to do it, especially if you're a research and a student and you're balancing all these different identities. Being able to say, what is it that I actually need, and is there a small step that I can implement that? If it's 10 minutes, is it 30 minutes? You know, for myself, that has looked like really disconnecting on the weekends as much as I can. And I put these two pictures up because there's that balance, right? The one picture I took whenever, the picture in nature I took because that is a way for me. I work as a counselor so much with my head and obviously physically sitting with people that I needed to get out of my head and actually use my body by moving. I have to use my hands by playing with my nephews and doing things that are out of using my brain. But then I put the picture of the paperwork. That's a picture that I sent to Dr. Shupp one Saturday. It was a beautiful day here in Pennsylvania, and I was so disappointed that I had to stay inside to work on paperwork. But at the same time, for me, that was a self-care rhythm where as you can see the stack, that wasn't even all that needed to be done, but that was paperwork that needed to be handed in. And by working ahead, that was a self-care rhythm for me that allowed me to be more at rest in those weeks to come. So recognizing, just like was mentioned, that there are going to be seasons where maybe it doesn't feel as possible, but being able to ask yourself, what is it that I need? Where am I lacking? Maybe it's like needing to really ask yourself the question that a lot of times we're asking clients of what it is that they need. What is it that you need? And is there a small step that you can take to prioritize that time? Okay. And then the next one, being able to find your tribe, as we say. So this is something that was talked a lot about in my graduate program, and being able to have people in your life that are supporting you. And again, coming back to that thought that we spend so much time giving, supporting, pouring out. Who are the people that are pouring into you, or people that you can feel supported by? So I listed a few, maybe it's peer consultation or group supervision, people that you've worked with in the past, people that you were in a training program with. But I also have found, man, I also need those people who are not connected to counseling at all, people that I can go for walks with. Again, because of COVID, this has been really difficult. And this was something I was concerned a bit prior to COVID. And just to self-disclose, I'm a single gal. So for me, the pandemic was very isolating. And there were these moments where I was like, I'm going to need to figure out, what does it look like to build some relationships that I can connect with? Who are the people in my bubble, so to speak? And so I relied heavily on my family and a few close friends that we were in that protective bubble. But maybe it's, doing happy hour through Zoom, or maybe it's doing a book club where you read and text a friend about what you're learning. I don't know what that time looks like, especially given the pandemic and the landscape of how hard it is with isolation. But I know the picture that I put there is I shared an office with a friend of mine who graduated a semester after me, and when we shared an office, we would do these little things for each other just to kind of boost one another in our time together. And then supervision, right? So supervision is something that I really, at the beginning, before I started, I had to really ask myself, what is it that I need? What is it that I am looking for? And yes, supervision is sometimes offered through the agency that you work for. And we all know that sometimes that is a positive experience and sometimes it's not. And so for myself, that was offered in the agency that I work for, but I knew that the communication style was something that would be really important to me. And so I had classes with Dr. Shupp and reached out. I knew him as a professor and knew that it would be helpful to, you know, have him, as I knew him as a professor, as my supervisor. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about the way that he and I do supervision is that there are times when it is very focused on a particular client or a particular population, and other times it's focused on me and how I'm doing. So there's that give and take where it isn't just logistics, but there's a variety of what the support is that I need, because as a new clinician through the pandemic, those are realistic challenges that I have. And obviously you want to find someone, there's not a lot under supervisor competency because we're going to be talking about that. Dr. Shupp's going to be talking about that shortly. But knowing that there's someone there who knows what they're talking about and that you can trust. And then just quickly, we put this in here just as a reminder that these aspects that I talked about, if not managed well, can lead to compassion fatigue, right? We are in these positions where we're at high risk for compassion fatigue and burnout because we are constantly giving. And I think one of the things that, you know, we can all agree on is that as this pandemic unfolded, we had never been through a pandemic before. So as counselors, we are going through it ourselves and also helping and supporting and being flexible and trying to help others get through it as well. So these are just some of the symptoms that are compassion fatigue. Did not list the ones of burnout because it's more of just the extreme, and there's a lot of information on that. But just so that you're aware that these are some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue. And it's not just a personal thing, right? There's risk, like ethical and legal risk when we are practicing under compassion fatigue. And then lastly, just the differences between the two, that you know, compassion fatigue is treatable. It is a little less predictable. It can come up, again, we're spending so much time supporting people that it can come up just in being worn out from having to give. And so, you know, it's kind of different than burnout, because burnout is more of a emerging over time. Compassion fatigue can come on quickly, but it's also treatable. So if you are noticing symptoms like were on the previous slide, being able to recognize those before it gets to the point of needing to switch professions altogether. And as I mentioned, some of the things that were discussed: self-care, managing your expectations, being able to disconnect as much as possible, having specific professional development geared towards the compassion fatigue and burnout for yourself, getting your own counseling, making sure you have support and supervision or in your tribe. Those are just some ways to kind of combat those feelings. So I'm now I talked a lot, but I'm gonna go ahead and switch the wheels over to Dr. Shupp. I don't know if there was anything in the chat box that's standing out to you, if you want to roll into supervision.
Yeah, Bethany, I've been trying to manage the chat, and I'm going to pass it over to you. And yeah, some people are really commenting about really trying to find support, and a lot of that has been virtual. And some folks actually talking about how utilizing their own therapists, right, when the roles are reversed, and actually going to therapy and having their own sounding board to be able to help manage their own self-care, work-life balance, as well as help manage that compassion fatigue. So some really, really good comments.
Great, great.
Yeah, so I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about research on and the importance of supervision. Again, I don't want this to be too academic, so I'm only going to briefly share a little bit about what some of the research says. And I want you to also recognize that I'm speaking aspirationally in the sense that it's important for all of us. Everyone is tuning in, I think, all the way from Jersey all the way to Fairbanks, Alaska. So we are literally hitting point to point in terms of where we're covering in the contiguous or in the United States. So it's important for you to look at state licensing board requirements in terms of what you need for your particular degree or license when it comes to receiving supervised hours. However, having said that, what we know, right, we talk about it in our professional graduate preparation programs. Supervision is important. It's important for regardless of where we're at, whether we are in a graduate preparation program or if we are a seasoned professional, that supervision does need to be ubiquitous and ongoing, a systematic process. I have a background working on college campuses. I kind of grew up working from a student affairs perspective. So there's a lot of research that kind of parlays from the student affairs field into clinical counseling work. And it really speaks to this concept of the multicultural competence, right? Having an awareness of self, having knowledge and skill sets and parlaying that into action is extremely important to help with all the things that Bethany had talked about. And you can see on the screen some of the research that has been available to us. Now, here's what's interesting about this. So we sometimes study this, right? Not always, not all programs have classes in supervision. So we know that it's important, we talk about it, and yet what does it say that oftentimes within the first 5 years of an individual's professional career, that almost 50% of our helpers, whether it's on a college campus or whether it's within a clinical setting, leave the field and don't return. And a lot of that has to do with the compassion fatigue and burnout that Bethany was talking about. So we espouse that supervision can really help create and mitigate the high attrition rates, but also create an environment to help with finding support mechanisms, right? Establishing boundaries, all those previous things that Bethany had mentioned. Bethany, can you advance the slide for me? Now, I'm speaking, we teach from the American Counseling Association Code of Ethics. I'm sure some of you, if you have a clinical psychology background, you might have your APA Code of Ethics. But what I think, again, is ubiquitous, right, across all fields, regardless of our specialization, is that we share very similar professional values. And looking at these professional values, I've often taught that it is not only from a counselor-client perspective, but it's also from a supervisor-counselor perspective as well. So that we need to practice in a competent and ethical manner. We need to honor diversity and embracing a multicultural approach. And we need to promote social justice. We also need to safeguard the integrity of our relationships. And that is true for those of us that are receiving supervision and are actually practicing in the to make sure that we are gatekeeping to make sure that we are as sound as we possibly can be. I use the example where a surgeon goes in and their instrument of practice is often a scalpel, right? When they're and they need to make a steady cut and they need to know all of those skills. Well, our instrument of practice is us, right? It's who we are and what we bring to the relationship. And we really need to be grounded in that work in order for us to be most effective. Next slide, Bethany. Thanks. So for us, right, we talk about the pillars and the foundational principles of our ethical behavior. And we, right, believe in these 6, right? Do individuals have the free will to control the direction of their own life? Are we, above all, not doing harm and working for the good of the individual? Are we treating individuals equitably, and are we honoring commitments? And are we also dealing truthfully with individuals with whom counselors come into professional contact? Well, how does supervision play into these 6 pillars or these fundamental principles of our practice? Next slide, Bethany. Thanks. So just in terms of framing supervision, our code of ethics, the most recent iteration was 2014, so 7 years ago. It's becoming a little dated, but one of the things is that there is an entire section F, on supervision, training, and teaching, and there are sections that I think parallel the work that we do with our supervisees very similar to the work that clients do or counselors do with their own clients, right? When we frame supervision, it has to be an ongoing relationship, right? Focused on two-way communication. I remember doing a training the one time and someone raised their hand and they said, well, when you talk about supervision, are you talking about administrative supervision or are you talking about clinical supervision? And my response was both. And it surprised me that individuals really had the paradigm that administrative supervision is one particular approach and clinical supervision is another approach. And if that is the case, I'm challenging that paradigm and asking folks to really reshift their paradigm to look at supervision holistically. And in doing so, there are a lot of parallel processes in terms of how a supervisor establishes supervision with the supervisee, right? Continually focused on not only their welfare, but also the welfare of the clients that they see. There is an informed consent for supervision explaining the approach, your credentials, if there are ethical concerns, a philosophical disposition, so on and so forth. But supervision is also a gatekeeping process. Supervision requires us to really assess the wellness and mental stability of the individuals that are entering the field. So for me, providing pre-licensed supervision, it really is a gatekeeping process, not to keep people out, but from an ethical guideline to really ensure that we are training and educating individuals to be as effective as they possibly can. So the one thing that I would encourage all of you is make sure that you are focusing on what your state-related requirements are with regards to supervision, because from an LPC perspective, a licensed professional counsel perspective, and the lack of state reciprocity from crossing state lines, most state licensure requirements around post-master's clinical supervision varies by state. So it's really important for you to, when you're embarking on this, to look at what are your state-related requirements to make sure that you are in compliance prior to obtaining your particular license or certification. What I wanted to end on, Bethany, if you can advance the slide for me. Thank you. Perfect. I know that this is a little small, and this is not mine. This is actually something that and it's in the reference section. I received this from UNC Greensboro when I was going through my approved clinical supervisor training. When we think about individual supervision, or I don't want to say individual supervision, but whether it's one-on-one or we're providing group supervision, but when you're looking specifically at you as the supervisee receiving supervision, or you as the supervisor providing supervision, and you're in that intimate relationship, one of the things that I think is really important is for us to provide some formal or informal inventory to try to understand how individuals are best supervised. So as a supervisor, if you remember nothing else from my comments, one of the things that I think might be helpful is for you to pose the question to your supervisees: how are you best supervised? What does that look like? Operationalize the term supervision. And if you're a supervisee, one of the things that I might encourage you is to try to elevate your voice and really find, what does effective supervision for you look like? So you can see this is one of several inventories, and it's meant to be a self-assessment for a supervisor, right? So it says, please indicate your perception of your style as a supervisor on a basic Likert scale. So do you as a supervisor find yourself very, very goal-oriented, or do you find yourself collaborative? Maybe you're more didactic. How open do you think you are? So on and so forth. But I like to use this where I'll provide it to supervisees and say, as a supervisee, what are you looking for in a supervisor? And I think that's a nice way of basically trying to assess if I'm coming from supervision where I'm extremely structured in my supervisory approach, but they highly value an open and relaxed environment, well, there's incongruence there. So I just think that this is a nice tool to really elevate and open up. When we have such a formal relationship with supervision, it's a nice way to really provide unique and meaningful interactions with our supervisees. Bethany, next slide, please. So the last thing that I want to share, and I think some of this might be my own personal, I'll say counter-transference, I think, in terms of how I was experiencing moving to a virtual world, both fully online for teaching as well as in my clinical practice. I'm a fan of Brené Brown and a lot of what she says, and this has really helped me over the last 12 to 15 months. She says that learning growth often happens when we are most uncomfortable. That is the growth zone. So she encourages us to lean into the discomfort of our work. And I think that that's really important. So from Bethany's perspective in terms of trying to balance and manage a level of self-care and manage compassion fatigue, as well as watch our level of burnout, as well as how supervision may be able to help with that. There are a lot of things that we do well, right? Each of us comes in with our own disposition, our own strengths. It's like if I asked you to pick up your pen and just now, if you have a pen sitting in front of you, pick up your pen and just pretend to sign your name on a student loan check or a mortgage payment, right? Just sign your name with your dominant hand. Now, if I asked you to switch hands to your non-dominant hand and do the same thing, if we were there together in person, I'm sure that there are a lot of people that might be laughing or giggling or feel uncomfortable. I know for me, once I figured out how to hold the pen, it was also hard for me to understand, well, how do I actually move my hand across the paper, let alone how do I actually form the letters of my name? Brené Brown challenges us, I think, in this time. She's not encouraging us to, and by proxy, I don't think Bethany nor I are encouraging you to lean into those things that come easy to us, right? What we're encouraging is to lean into writing with our non-dominant hand. It's those areas of discomfort during this time that if we pull those to the forefront, will actually make us better, healthier, well-rounded clinicians. So for example, for me, telehealth can be a valuable modality for conducting therapeutic and supervisory services. It means we need to take great care to ensure eligibility, confidentiality, support services, are individuals suited for this type of work. There's a variety of online platforms that exist, but I really think for me, COVID-19 has created an opportunity for all of us to explore new and innovative ways of providing services. I have needed to lean into it, and I have gotten, and by leaning into it, I have gotten better with it. And my hope and maybe my challenge to all of you is find new and innovative ways that you can lean in to those areas of discomfort within our profession, because I do think it will make us better, well-rounded, more effective clinicians in the long run. So I'm going to pause here. And Bethany, if we could just maybe sum up a brief summary with the brief time that we have left. And if there's anything you wanted to add from the chat, I know that the chat, there's been a lot of activity in the chat as well.
Yeah, so I've just been putting some of the poll questions in there. Monica had mentioned that back whenever we had asked the question about is there support, or do you feel that you have that available to you, that she was saying that her organization was actually pretty proactive in providing the support, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. So that we've been kind of chatting about that. But yeah, I think in summary, I think again, I'm speaking from my own experience, and again, part-time campus, part-time community, and knowing that these are very personal things that I have learned. I'm sure that we're all in very different positions and places, right? So hopefully there's something that stood out to you in the presentation of like, I wonder here if I can lean into this a bit more, or I wonder what my boundaries look like, or no, I'm not really feeling supported. Are there ways to make a change in those arenas? Again, recognizing that my situation is very different, because I do have flexibility within my schedule at this moment to be able to cut back on a client or two if needed, right? So being able to know that, like I said, you are also going through a pandemic. So what you need is also important. And it isn't, we have jobs as clinicians, but we are not just clinicians. So being able to take care of yourself outside of the work that you do is really important.
Yeah, and I'll just summarize by saying that, supervision is it's not just something that we say, which is aspirational. It regardless of where we're at in the profession, it should be ongoing, systematic. It's an ethical responsibility as part of our professional practice. So find ways for it to be unique and meaningful. And if so, not only will it help us grow in our professional processes, but it will also, I think, help us provide that balance, as well as perhaps help us have long, successful, fruitful careers in the field. So with that, we are near the end of our time together. Our final two slides are really just some resources as well as our contact information. So I want to say, before I pass it over to Bethany, thank you so much for your time and attention. I deeply value you being here, especially our folks that are 3 and 4 and 5 hours difference from us on the East Coast. I'm also very good over email. So if you have additional comments or questions or things that you would like to share or continue the conversation, please don't hesitate to email me. And Bethany, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I would say the same. Thank you all so much for waking up with us this morning. I hope, again, that there is even a nugget that would be helpful for you, even just to have an hour where you get to sit and hopefully drink some coffee if you're coffee people, or tea. But Thank you again so much. And again, thank you for the work that you're doing as clinicians, as practitioners. You know, that this is an important job that we get to do. We have the privilege of doing. And so thank you for your work and just your attention. Also, my email address is there. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. And as I said, there's our understanding is that you will have access to the PowerPoint. So hopefully you can take a look at some of the resources that are in there or references and read throughout some of the things that were used for this presentation. But thank you all, especially for engaging in the chat. I think it's helpful. And for those of you who were able to speak in the group, it's always helpful to kind of gauge what's going on and what folks are thinking. And so thank you for that.
Thanks, folks. Have a good rest of your conference.
Take care.